What if a woman everyone ignored fought a boar with a stick, faced the town's hate, and turned dough into defiance? Stick around, this gets wild. The wind howled across the red clay hills like a mourning widow, a mournful wail that carried loss in every gust. Dust swirled through the bones of Red Hollow, a dying town clinging to existence, slipping under doors and creeping into the cracks of every weather-beaten building. At the edge of town, where the dirt path faded into dry weeds, stood a crooked little shack, its planks sagging under years of neglect. Inside, Emily Harper stirred a pot over a creaking fire, the flames weak and sputtering. She moved slowly, methodically, her wooden spoon scraping the dented iron pot, stirring a stew that was mostly turnips and a little hope. 2 nights ago, she'd added the last scrap of bacon she had, a thin strip she'd saved for weeks. Now it was just her, the turnips, and the silence, thick as the dust coating her floor. Emily was 35, broad in the hips, sturdy in the arms, with the kind of face folks politely called homely when they bothered to speak of her at all. Too poor to dress it up with anything finer than patched cotton, too smart to pretend the whispers didn't cut. Red Hollow had talked about her since she was 20, first with pity, then disdain, and now with boredom, like she was a story too old to care about. She'd grown thick where other women grew elegant, her dresses letting out seams year after year, while the world moved on without her. Once she'd had dreams of owning a bakery, of waking to the scent of fresh dough and cinnamon filling a warm room. A dream so close to freedom she could almost taste it. But dreams had a way of going stale in Red Hollow, turning brittle and crumbling like old bread. Her parents were long dead, buried in the hard earth beyond the hills. Her brother had gambled away the family land when she was 23, then skipped town without a backward glance, leaving her with the leftover pieces of a life that never fit quite right. She stirred the pot again, the steam rising faint and thin, her eyes tracing the worn lines of her hands. Her dog, Scout, limped across the dusty floor, his paws scuffing the boards as he settled beside her. Half blind, missing part of an ear, and smelling perpetually of river muck, he rested his head on her knee with a soft whine. Loyal, quiet, he didn't care if her shoulders were strong or her fingers calloused from kneading dough and chopping wood long after the dreams faded. She scratched his scruffy neck, her gaze drifting to the window. The setting sun cast a crimson glow over the barren landscape, the hills stretching out like a painting of something forgotten. Another day slipping away, another nothing to hold on to. A knock rattled the door, sharp and unexpected. Emily froze, spoon still in hand. No one visited. Not unless they wanted something, a favor she didn't have to give, a debt she couldn't pay. She set the spoon down, wiped her hands on her apron, and crossed the room, her boots thudding against the uneven floor. She opened the door a crack, peering out. Sheriff Hank Lawson stood there, his nose red as a raw wound, his hat tipped back, the faint stink of whiskey clinging to him like a shadow. "Emily," he said, his voice slow and thick, tipping his hat in that pitiful way folks did when they didn't know what else to say. "There's going to be a dance at the town hall next week. All the ladies are bringing pies. Just letting you know." She stared at him, eyes narrowing, searching his face for the catch. "Is that a request or a warning?" she asked, her voice flat, guarded. He chuckled, uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Just thought you might want to feel part of things, is all." His words hung there, awkward, heavy. "I've made peace with Not," she said, shutting the door before he could muster anything else, the wood slamming against the frame with a dull thud. A pie for the town dance? She could see it already. The smirks, the whispers, the banker's daughter giggling behind her lace fan, some fool cowboy bowing low as a joke, pretending to court her while the room snickered. She'd seen it before, felt it sink into her skin. The way they made a show of poor Emily, like she was a stray dog to pity or a dare to win over a bottle of cheap liquor. But that night, something different stirred inside her. A quiet fury, not loud or hot like a fire, but heavy and old, like embers buried under ash, glowing faint but alive. She didn't deserve this. Not really. Not this life of scraps and silence, of being the town's worn-out tale. No one had come to save her, and she wasn't the sort to beg, to hold out her hands and plead for mercy. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames, Scout snoring softly at her feet, and let the thoughts settle. The next morning, she made up her mind. She grabbed her basket, old, patched with twine, the handle worn smooth from years of use, and headed out, the door creaking shut behind her. She'd go to the hills, to Widow's Creek, where berries grew wild and red near the water's edge. Not for the dance, not for their pity or their plates, but for herself, for something she could hold in her hands and call her own. The walk was long, the path winding and overgrown, a tangle of thorns and scrub that snagged her dress with every step. She pushed forward, her boots crunching against the dry earth. The sun climbing high and beating down like a judgment she'd long stopped fearing. Sweat beaded on her brow, trickled down her back, soaking the faded fabric clinging to her skin. She swatted at flies buzzing around her face, cursed the heat under her breath, and kept going, step after stubborn step, until the sound of rushing water reached her ears. The creek sparkled ahead, cutting through the hills, its banks lined with scrub and stone. Birds chirped overhead, darting between the pines, their calls sharp and free in the still air. She knelt by the water, setting her basket down, the cool rush soothing her aching feet as she brushed the dirt from her hands. Nestled near the bank were the berries, plump, wild, blood-red, hanging heavy on the bushes. She reached out, plucking them one by one, her fingers staining dark as she dropped them into the basket. She hummed to herself, an old tune she barely remembered, something her mother used to sing when the days were kinder. Scout nosed the grass nearby, his tail wagging slow, his half-blind eyes squinting against the light. For a moment, it felt good, quiet, simple, hers. Then the silence shifted. Scout growled, low and rough, his ears twitching. The birds went still, their songs snuffed out. A rustling came from the brush, too loud for a rabbit, too purposeful. She froze, her hand full of berries, juice dripping between her fingers. She turned slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs. A wild boar stood just 30 paces away, its tusks glinting in the sunlight, eyes fixed on her like she was prey. It was enormous, its bristled hide quivering with muscle, its snout steaming in the cool air, its hooves pawing the earth. She didn't scream. She dropped the berries, letting them scatter across the dirt, and grabbed the biggest stick she could find, a thick, jagged branch half buried in the undergrowth. Her hands tightened around it, steady despite the tremble in her legs. The boar snorted, a harsh burst of sound, and charged, its bulk tearing through the brush, hooves pounding the ground like thunder. She swung the stick with all her strength, crack, smashing it across the boar's snout. It screamed, an awful, gurgling sound, blood flecking its face as it stumbled back, shaking its head. She held her ground, chest heaving, the stick slick in her grip. It reared back, roared, a noise that rattled her bones, and charged again, tusks low, aiming to rip her open. She ran, her boots slipping on the uneven ground, thorns tearing at her dress, her legs burning with every step. She stumbled, fell hard, rolling as its tusks slashed the air above her, close enough to feel the heat of its breath. Pain shot through her side, sharp and hot, but she scrambled up, gasping, reaching for the small knife she kept in her apron pocket, a dull, useless thing, but she held it anyway, her knuckles white. Scout barked, darting in, snapping at the boar's legs, his old body moving faster than it should. The boar didn't care. It wheeled, faster than anything that size ought to be, its eyes locking on her again. She braced herself, stick in one hand, knife in the other, ready to swing or stab or whatever it took. Then a shot rang out, loud and sudden, cutting through the air like a whip. The boar jerked mid-charge, its body twisting as it crashed to the ground, dust exploding around it. Its legs twitched once, twice, then went still, blood pooling beneath its snout, dark and thick. Emily blinked, her hands trembling, the knife still clenched tight. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her ears ringing. Hooves crunched behind her, slow and steady. A figure on horseback appeared through the brush, swinging down with a thud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm, steady. "You all right?" He was young, mid-20s at most, broad-shouldered, skin sun-kissed, eyes the color of river stones. A rifle hung over his back, barrel still warm, a lopsided smile tugging at his lips. She nodded, her heart still racing, her throat dry as dust. "I was just picking berries," she rasped, her voice shaking more than she'd admit. He looked at the boar's carcass, then back at her, his smile widening. "Well, you damn near picked a fight with death instead. That was brave, stupid brave, the best kind." She stood, brushing dirt from her torn dress, her pride stinging as much as her scraped knees. "I didn't need rescuing," she snapped, though her hands betrayed her, shaking as she dropped the stick. He raised an eyebrow, nodding at the knife and the branch. "Sure, looked like you had it handled with a twig and a paring knife." She smirked despite herself, a flicker of something loosening in her chest. "Could have gotten a few good stabs in before it gored me," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. He chuckled, reaching for her arm to help her up, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'm Ethan," he said, meeting her eyes. "Ethan Carter." The name hit her like a slap. Carter, as in Carter Ranch, the richest family in the county, ruled by King Carter, a man folks whispered about like he was half myth, half tyrant. "What are you doing way out here?" she asked, pulling her arm back, wiping sweat from her brow. "Exploring. Escaping. Bit of both," he said, glancing around at the creek, the hills, then back at her. "You live nearby?" She hesitated, her guard up. "Just south of town," she said, watching his face for a sign he'd heard the stories. Emily Harper, the town's sad, fat joke. Nothing. His eyes didn't flicker, didn't judge. "Maybe you didn't know. That was good. You got arms like a lumberjack," he said, nodding at her hands, still stained with berry juice and dirt. She laughed before she could stop herself, a rough, real sound that surprised her. "And you got charm like a fox and timid like a miracle," she shot back, her smirk lingering. He grinned, reaching into his saddlebag and pulling out a canteen. "Care for some water? I'm told it's polite after savon someone from a boar." She took it, drank deep, the coolness cutting through the grit in her throat. He watched her, easy, no mockery, just interest. "I'd offer you some stew," she said, handing it back, "but it's mostly turnip and poor decisions." He laughed, a warm, rolling sound. "Best stew I ever had was squirrel, whiskey, and regret. I ain't picky." They sat by the creek, the boar's body cooling in the dirt, Scout sniffing the air warily as he settled beside her. They talked, a drifting conversation, nothing urgent, just words flowing like the water nearby. He didn't stammer over her size, didn't glance at her hips or her calloused hands, didn't offer pity for her age, just listened, nodded, asked questions like he cared. The sun dipped lower, casting gold over the hills, and he stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes steady. She tilted her head, half smiling. "You plan on rescuing more women from wild hogs?" "I was thinking maybe I'd drop by sometime. Help fix your roof if you got one that leaks." Her heart stuttered, hope tangling with doubt, old scars aching under her skin. "You don't know who I am," she said, her voice low, testing him. He paused, holding her gaze. "Do I need to?" She didn't answer, couldn't find the words. "All right then," he said, mounting his horse. "I'll bring nails. Maybe some flour, if you bake." "I used to," she said softly, almost to herself. He tipped his hat, a glint in his eye. Let's see if you remember how. He rode off, the setting sun framing him in gold, dust trailing behind him like a fading dream. Emily stood there long after he vanished, staring at the trail, the dead boar, the crushed berries scattered in the dirt. No one had looked at her like that in years. Not like a joke, not like a burden, but like a woman. For the first time in forever, she didn't feel like she was waiting to die. She felt like something might begin. The first time Ethan returned, it was just after sunrise, the sky pale and streaked with pink. Emily had barely finished feeding Scout, a handful of scraps she'd scrounged, and splitting a fresh stack of kindling, her axe biting into the wood with a steady thwack. She heard the crunch of hooves along the dry path leading to her shack and stepped outside, apron dusted with flour from habit, her brow furrowed against the early light. He was already grinning when he dismounted, a sack of flour slung over his shoulder, a small pouch of nails jingling in his hand. "Mornin', Miss Harper," he said, tipping his hat with a flourish that made her roll her eyes. "You remember my name?" she said, surprised, leaning the axe against the porch rail. "Well, when a woman nearly kills a boar with a stick, it tends to stick in a man's memory," he replied, his grin widening. She tried not to smile, but her cheeks betrayed her, warming despite herself. "You really came back," she said, crossing her arms. "I brought flour like I promised. And nails. Figure we could see if your oven still has life in it. And your roof too." She hesitated, then opened the door wide. "Hope you don't expect anything too fancy. Most of my recipes died from neglect." Inside, the shack was cleaner than he might have expected. Sparse, but homey, the fire crackling low on the hearth, the air tinged with smoke and turnip stew. He set the supplies on her wobbly table, glancing around, shutters patched with scraps of wood, a single chair with a cracked leg, a quilt folded neat on a cot in the corner. "You fix the shutters," he noted, nodding at the repairs. "I fix what I can," she said, pulling out a chipped bowl from a shelf. "I was poor before it was fashionable." He met her eyes, his voice plain but firm. "I'm not here out of pity, Emily. I'm here 'cause I want to be." She glanced at him, uncertain, searching for a lie in his words, but his gaze was too steady to doubt. She started measuring flour, her hands moving slow at first, muscle memory waking up after years of sleep. He rolled up his sleeves, stepping beside her, ready to help. The first loaf was terrible, dense, flat, tasteless, a lump of failure. They spat it out, laughing hard, the sound bouncing off the walls, her chest shaking with it. "That's a brick, not bread," he said, wiping his mouth. "Your fault for mixing it wrong," she shot back, still grinning. The second was a little better, holding shape, though it crumbled too easy. The third filled the shack with the warm scent of yeast and sugar, golden and soft when they pulled it from the fire. They tore into it, nodding at each other over the crust. "Still got it?" he asked, his mouth full. "You burned the first two," she said, smirking. "Every good baker needs an assistant to ruin things once in a while." "Keeps her humble," he replied, leaning closer, his elbow brushing hers. For the next few days, he came back often, sometimes with fresh eggs still speckled with straw, sometimes wild honey dripping gold in a jar, once a small bag of spices from a trader passing through town. Sometimes he brought just stories, tales of riding through storms, of fishing creeks with nothing but a stick and string, of nights under stars that felt bigger than the world. She'd never met a man who smiled so easily, who listened so carefully, his head tilted like her words were worth hearing. Most folks, if they listened at all, just waited for their turn to talk, but with Ethan, she felt heard, seeing like she wasn't invisible anymore. They sat beneath the oak tree one night, bread cooling on the windowsill behind them, the horizon burning orange and red. "Why are you really here?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above the rustle of leaves. He thought about it, staring at the sky, his fingers picking at a blade of grass. "You ever feel like everything folks expect of you is wrong, all the time?" She nodded, slow, the weight of her own life pressing down. My family wants me to take over the ranch, marry the banker's daughter, breed horses, count profits till I die. I don't want that. He looked at her, his eyes steady. I want this. He motioned to the loaf behind them. I want a bakery, something made by hand, not handed to me. Something warm, not bought. She swallowed, her throat tight. And you think you can get that with me? He turned to her fully, his voice low, sure. Emily, you're the first person I've met who doesn't wear a mask. You say what you mean. You fight for yourself. That's rare. Her chest burned, emotion crawling up slow and hot, like a fire she'd forgotten how to tend. I'm not what they want for you, she said, her voice cracking. I'm not what they want either, he replied, reaching for her hand, his fingers rough but gentle against hers. Silence stretched between them, heavy but soft, and then they kissed. Not shy or gentle, but messy, real, with all the unpracticed one of two people who never thought they'd find this. The next day, everything changed. Word got out. Maybe a rider spotted him leaving her shack at dawn. Maybe Sheriff Hank Lawson let it slip over a bottle at the saloon. By dusk, Red Hollow was buzzing, the whispers sharp and cruel. Ethan Carter's courting the hippo. One man laughed at the bar, his voice thick with beer. Guess he's got a taste for lard with his bread. Emily ignored them. She'd survived their barbs before, built walls high and thick against their venom. But Ethan didn't hide. He walked beside her to the market the next morning, bought her thread for her torn dress, offered his arm like she was a lady, not a laughingstock, and smiled like a man in love, not ashamed. That night, two riders showed up at her cabin, their horses snorting in the dark. She didn't open the door, just peered through the window, her breath fogging the cracked glass. They threw a stone at her steps, heavy and loud, then rode off laughing, leaving behind a scarecrow rigged up with one of her old dresses stolen from the line, a pig's head skewered on top, its eyes blank and staring. She dragged it to the fire pit, burned it without a word, the flames licking high, the stink of charred flesh and fabric choking the air. Ethan came the next morning, saw the ashes still smoldering, and his face hardened, his jaw tight. We need to leave, he said, his voice low, urgent. She folded her arms, standing firm. This is my home. This is your prison, he shot back, stepping closer. Come away with me. Let's go north. I got money stashed, enough to build a little place, a real bakery, a clean start. She shook her head, doubt clawing at her. I'm 35, Ethan. I've got more past than future. I don't want the future without you, he said, his hands gripping hers, his eyes fierce. She felt it, his truth solid as stone. But something deep inside resisted. Fear and pride knotted together from too many years alone. That night, they sat on her porch, the fire crackling low inside, the air cool and sharp. I loved someone once, she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the crickets. A long time ago, he said he'd marry me, that he didn't care what people thought. But when the time came, he walked away, married a girl half my size, with hair like spun gold. Told me he was doing me a kindness. Ethan was quiet for a long while, his hands resting on his knees, his breath slow. Then he spoke, soft but sure. I don't have spun gold, but I got hands that know how to hold on. She looked at him, her pulse thudding in her ears. You really want to marry me? More than anything, he said, his voice breaking just enough to make her believe it. The wedding happened 3 mornings later, quiet and small. No church, no crowd, just a preacher from a next town over standing in the field behind her shack. Her dress was sewn from old curtains, patched and plain, but she wore it like it mattered. He wore his best shirt, a crooked tie knotted loose around his neck. Scout barked at the horses like he was giving her away, his tail wagging despite his limp. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her like he'd found something sacred, and Emily cried. Not from sadness or fear, but because life had finally given her something soft, something hers. They didn't get a honeymoon. That night, while they packed her few belongings, a quilt, a pot, A handful of clothes, a rock shattered their window, glass spraying across the floor. A note was tied to it, scrawled in jagged letters. Leave, or we'll bury her. Ethan's fists clenched, his knuckles white, his breath coming fast. I'll find him. I'll make him pay. She grabbed his arm, her grip firm. No, we run. We live. By morning, they were gone, riding north under a gray sky, traveling by night to avoid eyes, sleeping beneath trees with branches scratching the stars. They forded rivers, the water cold and swift, soaking their boots, their clothes. They lived on cornbread baked over campfires, coffee brewed in a dented tin, Ethan carrying her when her feet blistered, Emily hunting rabbits with a slingshot when his shoulder ached from the load. They were equals, not rescuers, not rescued, just two people holding on. One day they stopped beside a wide river, the sky overcast, the wind sharp against their faces. Ethan went quiet, staring across the water, his hand tracing a mark carved into a tree, a cut in the bark, a Carter sign from tracking cattle. My father sent my brother after us, he said, his voice hollow, his fingers lingering on the wood. Her blood ran cold, her hand tightening on the rifle slung over her shoulder. How do you know? This mark. It's his way. She gripped the gun tighter, her jaw set. You regret it? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing her gut. He turned to her, his eyes fierce. Not one damn second. That night, they huddled close under a tarp, rain tapping steady on the canvas, the air damp and heavy. She listened to his heartbeat, strong against her cheek, her arm wrapped around him. You still want that bakery? She asked softly, her breath warm against his neck. He laughed in her hair, a quiet, rumbling sound. More than ever. His arms tightened around her. Then we'll build it, she said, her voice firm. Even if they come for us. Especially if they come for us. The storm passed, the rain slowing to a drip, and they rode deeper into the mountains, hoping to find a town where no one knew her name, where his father's shadow didn't stretch. They found an old shack near a creek lined with pines, half collapsed. No roof, no door, smelling like squirrel droppings and rot, but its bones were solid. This could work, Ethan said, grinning through the exhaustion etched in his face. Emily stood in the doorway, wind blowing her hair wild, her hands on her hips. We'll need windows. An oven, a proper one. We'll build it. That night, they made love beneath the stars, a blanket pulled tight around them, the scent of pine sharp in the air. It was clumsy, sweet, perfect in the way only two broken people finding comfort can be. They slept wrapped in each other, dreaming not of fear or fire, but of sugar, yeast, and the warmth of something rising. By morning, Emily woke first, stepping outside barefoot, the cold earth biting her soles. She looked at the clearing, the creek, the trees stretching tall and quiet. For the first time, the world didn't feel like a place that had rejected her. It felt like something waiting to be claimed. Ethan stepped out beside her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair a mess. Mornin', Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice rough with dawn. She smiled a rare, full thing. You hungry? Starvin', he replied, stretching his arms. Then let's build a damn bakery, she said, turning back to the shack, her shoulders square. The days that followed were hard, but theirs, calloused hands and aching backs, dragging lumber from nearby ruins, chopping fallen trees with a rusted axe, crafting what they could with little more than stubborn will and scavenged tools. Each plank nailed into place, each brick stacked for their oven, was a quiet defiance against wealth, against expectation, against the ghosts of lives neither wanted anymore. They found a rhythm in the wilderness. Ethan built while Emily cooked, gathering wild onions and nettles, hunting rabbits with a slingshot, stitching blankets from old feed sacks she'd packed. Ethan fished in the creek, set traps for game, read to her by firelight from a water-damaged almanac they'd found in the shack, his voice stumbling over the faded words. At night, wrapped beneath wool, their bodies pressed close, they whispered dreams of sourdough crusts, gingerbread spiced sharp, pies with lattice tops, a shop window with her name painted in gold. Sometimes they spoke of red hollow, brief, bitter mentions of the past, but mostly they didn't, letting it fade like smoke on the wind. Emily had never felt younger, never felt more alive. In the quiet between shores, she caught her reflection in the creek. Not thinner, not prettier, but fuller somehow. Her eyes bright with something new, her laughter coming easier, spilling out when Ethan tripped over a root or burned his fingers on a hot pan. When he touched her, his hands rough but soft, tracing her arm, her neck, her face, he did it like he'd found something sacred, something worth keeping. Then one morning, she woke to silence. No crackle of fire, no whistle from the pot, no Ethan humming off key while he split wood. The shack was empty, the air too still. "Ethan," she called, stepping into the clearing, her voice sharp against the quiet. His horse was gone, the saddle missing from its hook. She spun, breath hitching, her eyes scanning the trees. Scout, grayer now, slower, whined and sniffed the air, his nose low to the ground. Her heartbeat thumped in her throat as she followed him to the tree line. Near the edge of the woods, she found it. A small patch of churned dirt, hoof prints pressed deep, a broken twig still swaying where it had snapped. Drag marks stretched into the brush, scuff marks from boots, his boots. He hadn't gone willingly. Ethan had been taken. She dropped to her knees, pressing her fingers into the tracks, reading them the way her father had taught her long ago. 3 horses, 2 riders, 1 dragged, heading north through the pines. Her eyes burned, her chest tight, but she stood, steady, cold fury settling in her bones. She packed fast, rifle slung over her shoulder, jerky stuffed in a sack. Her hunting knife slipped in her belt, a handful of nails rattling in her coat pocket for reasons she couldn't name. "Scout, stay," she said, her voice firm, and he whined but obeyed, curling up by the shack. She saddled her mare, the leather creaking under her hands, and rode like the devil was on her heels, the forest narrowing into dense pines, the air thick with sap and shadow. Ravens watched from above, their calls harsh and mocking. A hawk cried out somewhere distant, its scream fading into the wind. Hours passed, her thighs aching, the mare huffing beneath her, but she didn't stop. Not when the trail thinned, not when the light faded, not when fear twisted her gut like a blade. By dusk, she smelled smoke, faint but sharp, curling through the trees. She tied the horse to a low branch, her hands steady despite the tremble in her fingers, and crept forward on foot, her boots silent against the pine needles. Below, in a rocky clearing, a campfire flickered, spitting sparks into the darkening sky. 2 men sat beside it. One she recognized instantly, Jackson Carter, Ethan's older brother, his slick blonde hair catching the light, his permanent sneer twisting his face. The other was unfamiliar, grizzled, sharp-eyed, a jagged scar running across his neck like a warning. Ethan lay nearby, wrist tied tight with rope, his lips split and bloody, his shirt torn and stained red. His face was swollen, one eye shut, but he was alive, his chest rising slow. Her hand tightened on the rifle, her breath shallow. "You think she'll come?" the scar man asked, his voice gravelly, poking the fire with a stick. "Oh, she'll come," Jackson drawled, leaning back against a rock, his tone dripping with scorn. "She's dumb enough to believe this is love. All pigs are soft, stupid creatures." The scar man laughed, a harsh bark of sound. Ethan stirred, groaning low, his head lolling to the side. Emily's vision narrowed, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. She moved through the trees like a shadow, circling the camp slow and careful, her boots avoiding twigs, her breath held tight. She found a perch behind a boulder, high enough to see Ethan's face, bruised, bloodied but breathing. She exhaled, slow and silent, then aimed a rifle, her finger brushing the trigger. A branch snapped beneath her boot, loud, too loud. Both men leapt up, guns drawn, their eyes scanning the dark. "Who's there?" Jackson barked, his pistol glinting in the firelight. Emily bolted, shots ringing out behind her, bark exploding beside her head as she dove for cover. She hit the ground hard, rolling behind a tree, her ribs screaming, dirt filling her mouth. "Come on out, sweetheart," Jackson called, his voice taunting, edged with glee. "We just want to talk." She didn't answer, her heart thundering, the rifle digging into her side. "You really think he's worth it?" the scar man yelled, his tone mocking. "A boy like him choosing you? You're a joke. That did it." She rose, took aim, and fired, the bullet catching the scarred man in the leg. He screamed, collapsing into the fire, flames licking up his clothes as he thrashed. Chaos erupted, Jackson shouting, Ethan shouting something she couldn't make out, his voice hoarse. Another shot grazed her arm, pain lancing hot and bright up to her shoulder, but she kept moving, kept firing, her barrel smoking, her mouth dry. She rushed the camp like a storm, dropping to her knees beside Ethan, cutting the ropes with her knife, the blades sawing fast. "Get up," she rasped, her voice raw. "We're going—" "I told you to stay safe," he croaked, his good eye wide. "Shut up and run," she snapped, hauling him to his feet. They sprinted into the woods, shots echoing behind them, bullets clipping branches overhead. Ethan stumbled, his legs weak, but she pulled him forward, her teeth gritted, her arm throbbing, blood running hot down her sleeve. They ran for what felt like hours, lungs burning, legs shaking, until the moon hung high and the gunfire faded to silence. She collapsed against a tree, breath ragged, Ethan sinking beside her, his hands touching her face like she might vanish. "You got shot," he said, horrified, his fingers brushing the wound. "It's not bad," she lied, her voice tight, pain pulsing with every heartbeat. "I've burned myself worse." He started to argue, his brow furrowing, but she reached up and kissed him. Not soft, fierce, her lips pressed hard against his. "I will not bury you," she whispered, her forehead against his. "Do you hear me? I've buried too much of my life already." He held her tight, his arms trembling but strong. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice breaking. They stayed hidden for 2 days, tucked in a shallow cave, the wind whistling outside. Her arms stiffened, the graze scabbing over. The bleeding stopped, though it ached like hell. Ethan insisted on cleaning it, tearing a strip from his shirt, his hand shaking as he worked, his voice steady as he muttered about keeping it clean. He told her about the ambush, how Jackson and the scarred man had grabbed him while he fetched water at dawn, how they'd planned to drag him home, marry him off to some rich girl, break him like a horse. "They said you'd forget me eventually," he murmured, tying the makeshift bandage. She chuckled, pain but real. "Fools." On the third morning, they rode again, through valleys and ridges, under a sky that watched them with cold, endless eyes. They found a small town nestled between hills, too quiet to ask questions, too small to care. They paid a carpenter with a few coins Ethan had stashed, traded bread for lumber, reinforced a cabin with their own hands. The scars on Ethan's face faded slow, the bruises turning yellow, then gone. The one on Emily's arm didn't. It stayed, a rough pink line, a badge she wore without shame. They built again, not just a home, but a storefront, windows wide, a real oven of brick and iron, a sign above the door in hand-carved letters. The Rising Sun Bakery. On opening day, no one came. The street empty, the air still. By day 3, the smell of bread drew them in. Farmhands with dirt under their nails, widows with patched shawls, kids with hungry eyes and sticky fingers. By day 7, a woman from the church knocked, asking shyly for the recipe to Emily's cinnamon rolls, her voice soft with awe. They never spoke of Red Hollow, not its dust, not its hate, but one evening a rider appeared, dust-covered and road-worn, his horse stamping at the edge of the clearing. He didn't enter, just watched from a distance, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Emily stepped out, rifle in hand, her stance steady. It was Jackson, his eyes hard, red-rimmed, meeting hers across the space. He said nothing, his jaw tight. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. He turned, rode off without a word, swallowed by the dusk. Later that night, Emily and Ethan sat on the porch, sharing a slice of honey pie, the crust flaky, the sweetness lingering on their tongues. Her stitches had healed. His lip was whole, but something lingered between them, a silence stronger than words. "You afraid he'll come back?" Ethan asked, his voice low, his hand resting on hers. "No," she said, her eyes on the horizon. "He saw what he needed to." "What's that?" "That I'm not running anymore." Ethan nodded slow, then grinned, squeezing her hand. "You're the toughest woman I've ever met." She smirked, leaning into him. "I've killed a boar, baked bread in a fire pit, and shot a man for you. You better appreciate that." "Oh, I do," he said, drawing her close. "Every damn day." They sat until the stars blinked into view, the night calm, the world finally quiet. The sign swung gently in the morning breeze, its carved letters gleaming gold in the early light. The Rising Sun Bakery. Below it, a line of townsfolk stretched along the wooden sidewalk, boots tapping impatient rhythms, noses tilted up to catch the scent of honey glaze and warm cinnamon drifting from the open door. Emily stood behind the counter, cheeks dusted with flour, sleeves rolled high, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. Folding dough, slicing loaves, lifting steaming trays from the oven. Her scarred arm didn't make her flinch anymore. It was a reminder, a mark of a life she'd fought for, nearly died to keep. Ethan moved among the tables, greeting regulars with a nod, refilling mugs with strong black coffee. His linen shirt rolled to the elbows, his hair longer now, untamed by the rules of a ranch he'd left behind. When his eyes met hers across the room, there was still that flicker of awe, like he couldn't quite believe she was real, like she was a gift he'd never expected to unwrap. They'd been in Silver Creek 3 months, long enough to be known, not long enough to be forgotten. The townsfolk had warmed to them quick, drawn first by the food. Crusty loaves, sticky buns, pies with tops woven tight. Then by the feeling, the way the bakery was more than bread. It was refuge, a place where voices softened, where folks lingered over their cups, where laughter came loud and free. Emily had transformed. Not her shape, not her face, but her spirit, a brightness in her eyes, a force in her words, her posture, her gaze. She'd learned to command space without apology, to smile without bracing for a barb. She didn't need defending. She was a defense. But peace, she knew, was a fragile thing, a thread that could snap with a single tug. The first warning came on a Tuesday, just after sunrise, the air crisp and golden. Ethan found it nailed to the post out front, a single white feather, clean and sharp, the symbol of the Carter Ranch, a call for surrender or a demand for blood. He brought it inside without a word, set it gently on the counter, his fingers lingering on the quill. Emily stared at it, her jaw tight, her hands still dusted with flour. "They found us," she said flatly, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. Ethan nodded, his eyes dark, his silence heavier than words. Neither spoke of leaving. Running wasn't an option anymore. By dusk, the line outside had thinned, the last customers drifting off with paper-wrapped loaves, but the tension inside lingered, thick and unspoken. "They won't come quietly," Ethan murmured as they closed up shop, locking the door, the feathers still sitting on the counter like a loaded gun. "My father doesn't do quiet. He'll bring muscle, lawyers, guns if it comes to that." She turned to him, her hands empty but steady. "Let him." He hesitated, his brow creasing. "They'll make it ugly." She stepped closer, her voice low, hard. "I am ugly. That's what they think, isn't it? Ugly, fat, worthless, the shame of their son. His eyes flared, anger flashing hot. "You know I don't believe that." "I do," she said, cutting him off. "I just needed to say it first." She walked to the window, looked out over the hills where storm clouds gathered, dark and heavy on the horizon. "They think they can scare us out, buy us off, make us small again. But I've been small. I've been quiet. I've been nothing to everyone for so long. I almost forgot I was something to myself." He stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "They're not going away," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "No," she agreed, leaning into him. "They're not." 2 nights later, the Carters arrived, 6 riders rolling into Silver Creek under a sky bruised with clouds, their saddles polished, rifle scabbards glinting at their sides. Jackson led them, clean-shaven, grinning like a man with a loaded gun and no conscience, his blonde hair slicked back, his eyes sharp with malice. Behind him rode William Carter, their father, tall, cold, his suit spotless despite the dust, his hawk-like eyes scanning the street with a predator's calm. The townsfolk scattered like leaves, doors shutting fast, curtains twitching behind glass. Emily stepped onto the porch before they could dismount. Ethan beside her, his jaw set, his hand resting near the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Jackson spat into the dirt, his grin twisting. "Didn't think pigs knew how to run bakeries," he called, his voice loud, meant to carry. Emily didn't flinch, didn't blink, her hands steady at her sides. "Didn't think cowards showed up with 6 men to threaten 2, she replied, her words ringing clear across the quiet street. William dismounted slow, his boots landing with a heavy, deliberate thud, his gaze locking on Ethan. "I gave you time," he said, his voice venomous, smooth as a blade. "Time to come home. Time to fix your mistake. You wasted it." Ethan stepped forward, his hand dropping from a rifle, but staying close. "She's not a mistake," he said, his voice low, firm. William's mouth curled into a sneer, his eyes sliding to Emily. "She's nothing." She took a step down, her boots hitting the ground, her hands empty but her spine straight. "I've scrubbed boar blood from my porch, dug lead out of my arm. Watch men like you ride off thinking they'd broken me," she said, her voice rising, steady and loud. "I've faced beasts, bullets, and your pathetic attempts at shame. You want to fight, old man? Then shoot me. Right here in front of this sign, in front of your son, in front of a town that knows me now, not as fat, not as unwanted, but as Emily Harper Carter, owner of the finest damn bakery between here and the Rio." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Jackson laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You think anyone here'll stop us?" he said, his hand resting on his gun. She didn't move, didn't waver. "No," she said, "but I will." A silence fell, heavy as a curtain, the wind stirring dust between them. Then the door creaked open behind her, and the townsfolk emerged, quiet, steady, stepping onto the porch, rifles in hand. The schoolteacher with his patched coat, the carpenter with sawdust still on his sleeves, the widow with the limp clutching a shotgun, even the sheriff, his badge glinting, rifle across his chest, giving a slow nod. They formed a half-moon behind Emily, their faces hard, their eyes on the Carters. William's gaze narrowed, his lips thinning. "You want a war?" he asked, his voice cold, directed at her. "Start it," she said, her chin high, her hands still empty. He looked at Ethan, his tone cutting. "You'll lose everything, the land, the money, the name." Ethan met his stare, unflinching. "I've already gained more than that. I gained her." William stared, a long, heavy moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Jackson, his voice flat. "This town's not worth the blood." Jackson's smile faltered, his hand twitching toward his gun, but he stopped. "Mount up," William said, climbing back onto his horse. The Carters rode off, their silhouettes swallowed by the dusk. Not a shot fired, the dust settling slow in their wake. When they were gone, Emily exhaled, her shoulders easing, the townsfolk lingering around her. Some clapped her on the back, their hands rough but warm. Others offered quiet praise, their voices soft, respectful. Sheriff Hank Lawson simply nodded, his eyes holding something close to reverence, then walked off into the twilight. Ethan pulled her close, kissing her forehead, his breath shaky. "You did that," he said, off threading his words. "No," she whispered, her arms wrapping around him. "We did." The next morning, the line outside the bakery stretched longer than ever, boots scuffing the wooden walk, voices buzzing with the tale of the standoff. Emily baked with fire in her bones, pride in her chest, a joy she didn't know she could hold. She watched Ethan laugh with a child over spilled jam, watched sunlight stream through their windows, and felt the last stone of doubt fall from her heart. She was no one's shame, no man's mistake, no town's punchline. She was the woman he chose, and more, the woman who chose herself. Later that night, as the stars blinked to life and the scent of bread faded into the cool air, they sat on the porch, his hand in hers, the quiet wrapping around them like a quilt. "Think they'll come back?" he asked, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "They might," she said, a slow smile curving her lips. "And if they do," she leaned into him, her voice low, warm, "then I'll bake something special, with a touch of cinnamon and a whole lot of vengeance." He laughed, head tipped back to the stars, the sound free and full. The world, once so cruel, was finally quiet, and this time, she knew it was hers. Love this tale of grit and heart? Subscribe and comment for more.